Have you ever been in a room where everyone was noticed, except you? Not because you failed, not because you weren't enough, but because you were always the one who was fine. If you grew up being overlooked without anyone meaning to hurt you, this video will explain why it still affects you today. Undervaluation doesn't always come from cruelty. Often, it comes from comparison. One child becomes the smart one. Another becomes the responsible one. Another becomes the talented one. And someone else quietly becomes the one who will be fine. Parents rarely say this out loud. They don't intend harm. But attention follows urgency. Praise follows visibility. Emotional investment follows whoever needs the most right now. Over time, one sibling receives emotional presence, while another receives assumptions. The assumption that you don't need as much. The assumption that you're strong. The assumption that you'll manage on your own. But the human brain doesn't thrive on assumptions. It thrives on recognition. When recognition is missing, the brain fills the gap with self-questioning. Children are meaning-making machines. They don't think my caregivers are overwhelmed. They think something about me must not be enough. And that belief doesn't disappear when childhood ends. It matures. It disguises itself. It follows you into adulthood wearing new names, self-reliance, low expectations, emotional independence. On the surface, the undervalued sibling often looks capable, calm, easygoing, low maintenance. Inside, there's a quiet negotiation constantly happening. Don't ask for too much. Don't take up space. Don't need what others need. Psychologically, this creates a strange internal split. One part of you becomes hyper-responsible. Another part remains emotionally hungry, but unsure if it's allowed to be. You learn to minimize your needs not because you don't have them, but because expressing them once didn't change anything. And the brain adapts. Research in developmental psychology shows that children who receive inconsistent emotional validation often develop heightened self-monitoring. They become exceptionally good at reading rooms, sensing moods, adjusting behavior. This isn't empathy by choice. It's empathy by survival. You learn to become what the environment needs, not what you are. Over time, self-worth becomes conditional. You feel valuable when you are useful, when you help, when you fix, when you stay quiet and stable. But when you are simply present without offering anything, there's discomfort. Because somewhere deep inside, your mind still believes love is earned, not given. One of the most painful parts of being the undervalued sibling is that nothing bad enough happened. There's no obvious trauma to point to, no clear moment where you were pushed away, just absence. And absence is harder to grieve than pain. Pain validates itself. Absence makes you doubt your perception. You wonder, am I exaggerating? Others had it worse. Why am I affected by this? So you dismiss your own experience before anyone else can. This self-invalidation becomes internalized. You downplay your achievements. You feel uncomfortable being celebrated. Compliments feel foreign, almost suspicious. Your nervous system learned early that being seen didn't last, so it doesn't fully relax when attention comes your way. There's also a quiet anger many undervalued siblings carry. Not explosive rage, but dull, heavy, lingering anger. Not just at caregivers, but at yourself. Why didn't I speak up? Why didn't I demand more? Why was I always the one to understand? But a child shouldn't have to demand care. They shouldn't have to compete for emotional presence. What often happens instead is emotional outsourcing. The undervalued sibling becomes the listener, the supporter, the emotional container for everyone else. You learn to hold space long before anyone holds space for you. In adulthood, this often translates into relationships where you are valued for reliability, but not always cherished for your inner world. People trust you, they lean on you, they come to you with their problems, but they don't always ask how you are. And when they do, you don't always know how to answer, because you learned early that your feelings were secondary, optional, manageable, quiet. Psychologists sometimes call this emotional invisibility. Not neglect in the obvious sense, but in the subtle sense of being emotionally unattended. It doesn't create chaos. It creates self-erasure. You grow up believing that being low impact is a virtue, that needing less makes you easier to love, that independence equals maturity. But emotional independence formed too early isn't independence. It's adaptation. A child who stops asking for comfort isn't healed. They're adjusting. Another pattern that emerges is comparison-based self-worth. When one sibling is openly praised, the undervalued sibling becomes hyper-aware of hierarchy. You measure yourself constantly. Am I doing enough? Am I impressive enough? Am I worth noticing now? And even when you succeed, there's a strange hollowness. Achievement doesn't land the way you hoped it would, because what you wanted wasn't applause. It was acknowledgement, to be seen without outperforming someone else. This is why many undervalued siblings struggle with imposter feelings. Not because they lack skill, but because worth was never stabilized early on. Worth became situational. If no one affirms you, doubt fills the space. And yet, there is resilience here. Undervalued siblings often develop deep introspection. You think a lot. You reflect. You notice patterns others ignore. You're emotionally intelligent, even if emotionally tired. You understand nuance. You see both sides. You hesitate before judging. But emotional intelligence without emotional nourishment leads to burnout. At some point, there's a reckoning, usually in adulthood, usually after giving too much for too long, usually after realizing that being easy to deal with came at a cost. The cost is self-connection. Here's the truth that brings both pain and relief. You were not invisible because you lacked value. You were invisible because the system around you didn't know how to distribute attention fairly. Families are emotional ecosystems. They reward immediacy, volume, crisis. Those who don't create waves often go unseen. That doesn't make you lesser. It makes you adapted.